hello again, and welcome to another edition of Forum for a Better Understanding. You know, I can't believe this is the 342nd program that we've done with this table with guests, but it is the first one, actually, that's labeled Science and Faith, Science and Religion. I don't know how. We've maybe skirted the issue before, and we've done it differently, but never have we actually put two people on this table that actually would like to share individually and collectively around that topic. Never have I had two people tell me you should do a program on faith and science and the combination. Obviously, it's been overdue, but I am just really glad that today we do have two guests passionately committed to a sense of harmony and equilibrium between the two, that there is not a schism or a split that is irreconcilable. At least I don't think they're going to come from that angle. We'll soon find out. The other thing about this program, it is totally unscripted. Normally, you say, oh, things seem to have a beginning and an end, and you know where you're going, Jim. Not this time. This one, we're leaving it to the grace of God and to our two contestants here to share with us from their own wisdom so many different things, and we'll see how together it makes a very interesting conversation. I'm really looking forward. Monsignor, could you begin by maybe just introducing yourself to those that don't know and why it is you told me at that meeting at the KNXT board, Jim, that's a show, I see a forum on that topic. Why do you see the topic, and who are you, Monsignor?
My name is John Griesbach. I'm presently a priest in the Diocese of Fresno and have been for 35 years. Going back to my younger years, I was very interested in science in the seminary and very pleased to find out that there was a marvelous way in which to integrate science and my understanding of faith. I think probably most people in their lives recognize that so much of what we have today that enriches our lives comes from the last 250 years of empirical science, and yet we've seen where there's been lots of conflict around the institutional church and how it's dealt with that. I remember seeing the newspaper last year when Galileo was finally given a funeral. Do you remember that? After 450 years. And quite honestly, when 450 years ago he looked through the telescope and saw Jupiter and those moons orbiting it and said, wow, maybe that's the way it works with the solar system. Officials of the church were not ready to embrace that. They actually looked through his telescope and denied what they were seeing. Part of that reason was because they had vested interests in faith, and they weren't sure whether this new empiricism was going to undermine that. And so there's been an obstacle between faith and science to some degree ever since then. And so I was anxious to share on this show because I thought that maybe we could speak about it in a way that we would see that there was no obstacle.
I am so glad, and I'm just hoping, and I'm seeing it start already, that there is a real possibility of making our viewers enriched and really inspired by the combination of presentations and conversation. David, you also independently put this on your short list of topics. You've written about it in the Community Alliance. You're really on to this. You are a scientist. You are a person of deep intellect, and you're a person of faith. When did all this start for you, and what direction has it gone, your commitment to both sides?
Well, like Father John, I have been interested in both arenas since I can remember, basically. But I never felt that one would offset the other in terms of the kind of background that I had. My family was open to, matters of science and matters of faith. And there was no sense that you had to make a choice between the two. As an undergraduate, I majored in experimental psychology and actually got very close to my advisor because we literally built the psych lab from the ground up in the 4 years that I was in college. Now, he was a very good Lutheran, and I asked him how he brought the two together. And what he said, in essence, was that he was compartmentalized, that he had his science here, and then he would go to church and he would have his faith there. But he could not and did not try to integrate the two. And in some ways, the very first person that I encountered who did that kind of integration came to me from a book that I read by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin,
Oh, yeah.
The Phenomenon of Man, and I was captivated by kind of the poetic imagery that he had, but also that he was a well-trained paleontologist doing original research on the Peking man, and yet he also could see how this fit into the larger scope of the universe, that it's one universe that has one creator. And that continued, and then when I got to eventually found my way to seminary, I encountered the theologian John Cobb, who 2 generations back through Charles Hartshorne and then to Whitehead began to develop a lot of ideas about how the universe actually is put together and explain it in a way that would allow us to comfortably talk about spirit and mind and body all in the same arena. So
this is so great to have people who are so passionate about things that are really important and asked to have a setting for it. So thank you for both being here. Monsignor, last night you did have a wonderful opening thought about how to present this, beginning with the church's understanding of Revelation. Do you want to begin with us that thought from how you'd frame this question in terms of, boy, Genesis would be written differently, wouldn't it?
Well, one of the things that I think we start with is about access to truth and reality. And our ancestors in faith were pre-scientific in the sense that they lived thousands of years ago. And the truth that came to them was through the intuitive methodology, through listening to and divining from all that was around them, and then crystallizing it out in the ways in which they had accessible to them, which was often through stories, through mythology. And over a period of time, they would explain the deepest of mysteries and touch onto that mystery through these different means of doing so. And early on in Christianity, we trusted that God speaks to us in a revelatory way, makes God's self known to us to some degree, the mystery of who God is, and that the Scriptures contain a revelation of who God is. But sometimes we understand that it's revelation, God is speaking to us about the mystery of what is, but how that happens is often misunderstood. And I think that's where so much of our trouble lies. There is a whole idea that speaks of the Scriptures as divine dictation, as if, God was saying, okay, write this. And, like it was speaking over the shoulder of a person, so that everything was on the same face value. God said it, and I believe it, and that settles it. With time, we came to discover that the how in which revelation worked was always in great respect of humanity and how humans operate. And so that it would be in the natural methodology of speaking in human ways that God would speak to us the truth of Him, the Word of God in human ways and in human fashioning. And so what we find a lot of times in our Scriptures is a contextual way of getting at what God would like to say to us. And the goal that we have is to mine that contextual truth and to be able to recognize there's a difference between the packaging of the truth and the truth itself. So I've devised a little way to illustrate that, and I'll try and do this very briefly. I have here an envelope with a $100 bill in it. And let's suppose that you're selling me a work of art for $100. So I say, okay, Jim, I'm buying that, and so here's payment. And I give you this.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Now, chances are you're going to open that envelope up, and you're going to pull the $100 out, and you're going to put that in the cash register.
Absolutely. I haven't seen one of these in a long time. These are good.
And I want it back, Jim.
Thank you. That piece of art was definitely worth even more than the $100.
Now, from the scriptural perspective or the revelatory perspective, you could say that if everything is of equal value, we'd put the envelope that it came packaged in as well as the $100 bill in the cash register.
But we don't do that.
But we don't do that. Within our tradition, we would say, no, the context is the envelope in which the valuable thing comes contained. And so take, for instance, the story of Genesis, the first story of Genesis. What it says in a beautiful and wonderful way in a story, the context of creation in 6 days, and using an ancient cosmology as a framework, it says that God is at the root of all that is. that God made things good and not evil or even neutral, and that God made humans the best of God's good creation. Well, that's the $100 bill in the story. Now, nearly 6,000 years later, in the age of science, we know today that the Jewish cosmology, though it made sense to the people of that time, is quite limited in terms from a scientific or an empirical position. And even to hold that cosmology would really limit us and handicap us for being able to deal with the world as it is and the truth that it contains. And so, within our tradition, we would say, wow, science gives us the story that would be told by the author of the first story of creation, were he to be living in our day. This book here, The Universe Story, does just that. It's written by two men, Brian Swim and Thomas Berry, both of them scientists and also theologians. And they wrote this book as a way of saying, well, if the author of Genesis was writing that first story, knowing what we know today, which is still precious little, we just have little parts to the puzzle, but from the parts that we have, here's the story he would tell. And you know what? The story that he would tell illustrates the wonder of God's presence in all that is. That everything is made good and beautiful and mysterious and wonderful. And the dynamics of creation are beyond our imaginations. And that his human creatures, from our perspective on this planet, is the best and the deepest of his good creation, for we're self-conscious and are able to know the one who is doing all of this and love God back. And so, from a science and religion perspective, if we're able to make a distinction between the $100 bill and the packaging that comes in, we can mine God's truth in beautiful and wonderful ways, not just simply through intuitive truth that comes to us from the scriptures, but also from empirical truth that also helps to illustrate the incredible reality that surrounds us.
This is very enlightening, at least to me, and I hope to our viewers. David, is there anything in what Monsignor said that you wind up having a similar read on, or that your own study, your own experience, and your own thoughts on this perhaps take us in another direction that willy-nilly the two of you can dialogue later? Is there something to jump onto or offer another beginning point?
Well, I suppose I could say at the beginning, I could just simply say amen, because there's nothing in what I've heard that is not things that we have not approached in the kind of disciplines that I've been studying. I mean, I tend to refer to that literal approach to the Bible as seeing it as a flat Bible. There's no depth to it because everything is exactly the same. And yet, if you can get into the material deep enough, you begin to feel the passion that led these people to express themselves the way they did. And that's where the Spirit comes alive, is kind of getting in sync with that passion that gave rise to that to begin with. So that's part of what I see about in terms of the biblical literalism. And one of the things that I think is important is that human beings, we are meaning-making creatures. If we're bombarded with data, we have to organize it, or we feel chaos, and feeling chaotic, is a very uncomfortable experience. But what's interesting about the kind of the mainstream scientific approach that still continues today, for the most part, is that they assume a purposeless and therefore meaningless universe in terms of how they approach their study. Things are not supposed to have an aim. They're not supposed to aim at something, a particular outcome, for example. And evolution is understood solely in terms of the process of natural selection, which, among other things, involves what species fits what niche better, and in what configuration does that species have to be to survive in that particular place. But when I'm leaping over, when you come to the human brain, you start thinking, now, why did we need to have the development that we clearly have? I don't see necessarily any evolutionary advantage in having the ability to think things through and, to communicate, et cetera. Yeah, it does help us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we would prevail the way we have prevailed. And my assumption is that in a sense, the need to have the universe move in the direction that God wants it to move, it led to the development of the human brain. It pointed in that direction. Because in process theology, God's aims are very general, but God is always aiming at intensity of experience based on the integration of divergent, divergent viewpoints, so that things that have been clashing before come together into a harmony that's much richer and much deeper and much more powerful, and that's part of God's aims. And so the human brain certainly, it has much more capacity to do that. We also, unfortunately, have a great deal of capacity to do a lot of damage to each other. And that's part of what I see, is that I think that our species is at a crossroads. Of course, it's easy to say that, and maybe it's not, but evolutionarily, our aggressive abilities certainly got us to a place that we can now dominate things if we choose to, or we can choose to do differently. But we have to transcend that. And that's where our religion comes in. Because if you think about some of what Jesus said in terms of turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, and if somebody's oppressing you, in essence, by demanding things, give them more than they're asking for, all those are counterintuitive. Those are our natural biological response would be exactly the opposite. Yeah. And in the neuroscience of today, they're beginning to realize that that's the higher order part of the brain, and that when we don't have those kind of connections so that those areas of the brain can govern, then we do tend to fall into that area where we're more violent. That is, we're beginning to research the kinds of things that can make us better human beings. So
what we have to do, they're telling me, is take our little break at this point. But please come back, because David Roy and Monsignor John Griesbach are going to be sharing again more about the connection that they hope to make clear between science and faith, science and religion. Stay tuned.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today, or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Welcome back to the second half of our program on science and faith, the dialogue, the possibility of a harmony, the possibility of an enriched symbiotic relationship, which is what we would all want, but it's not necessarily easily achieved in this society that is so polarized around certain issues. Our guests have been Monsignor John Griesbach from the St. Anthony Retreat in Three Rivers, and Reverend Dr. David Roy, an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and director of the Center for Creative Transformation here in Fresno. David had been sharing very deeply his own understanding of why this is so important at this time that we deal with this harmony and we look at Jesus, counterintuitive that he is, to lead us in a direction. Now, Monsignor has another thought that he'd like to lay on the table, and then we'll see if in the next 10 minutes he and David can share some more thoughts together. Monsignor.
What I would like maybe to share from a Catholic perspective, David, is that we're a sacramental people. In other words, at the core of our sacramentality is the belief that God, though invisible, is capable in some way of impacting us through powerful signs and symbols that speak to us on a variety of different levels, of conscious levels. There's the evident level, but then it speaks to us on a deeper level. It's kind of like, archetypal imagery. Archetypal imagery speaks to us from the very core of our beings, and it's carrying on that conversation whether we're conscious of it or not. And within our Catholic community, the sacraments are meant to do that, to make an invisible God somehow visible in some way, to mediate that mystery, because we realize that God ultimately is unknowable in the fullest sense of the word. We're creatures, and the mystery of all that surrounds us that we're exposed to all the time, whether through intuitive or empirical ways, lies beyond our grasp. And yet we're constantly being drawn to find that and to search it out. I just recently read a book by Thomas Green called The Elegant Universe, and he's a string theorist. According to string theory, there are some basic building blocks that create all the material world as we come to know it. But it exists on such a small level that it's unable to be measured or seen. And as a result, the way they get at it is through mathematical equations that then later on, when you put them into practice, work out and follow up in some consistent way. And Green would say that there are a number of different experiences that we have, a number of theories that are kind of going together like fingers. You have gravity, you have a number of other different elements, and their relationships between them. And we're learning about them from the top down, but we're working toward the thing that unites them all, which is, in a sense, so far unable to be reached, and yet we're being drawn into that reality. And these could be mutually exclusive, but they're all connected. At least it seems that they're all connected, and they're all guiding us on a journey that's leading us to this deeper reality. And I think that science and I think that religion are two of those types of things, each in their own way, that are leading us and putting us in contact with what lies at the very core of reality that we experience and that we see, that challenges our understanding, and that we are hungry for that. And so we let each of them lead us in its own way, and we look to find a way to integrate that, trusting that it will be integrated ultimately at some moment in time. But in the meantime, there are gifts given to us all to help us along the way.
Well, to be presumptuous, I think that Whitehead has actually described what is the commonality for all of them, in the sense that from his cosmology basically says that all of reality is constituted out of what he called actual occasions. These are real events that come into being and perish over and over and over again. And they have both a physical pole where you can deal with causality, and a mental pole where you can where you have the foundation for what we think of as mentality. Now, most of reality, does not develop the mental pole greatly, but it's there. When it comes to the human being, obviously, and other creatures, the mental pole is highly developed. I won't go into it further than that, but the point is that what he says, that process is more fundamental than substance. The substance comes into being out of process. So understanding process is really what we need to do. And that the metaphor that you were suggesting of the hand and the fingers means that it's all pointing to the same kind of, I would say, event that ties everything together. And in Whitehead's system, when he was beginning to finish it up, he realized that there was an agency that was missing, which in Process and Reality he ended up calling God. And because of the freight that gets attached to that term, he changed it later and talked about divine eros and other kinds of terms. But what God's role is to receive the world tenderly, and in a sense, that's the experience of love, grace, full acceptance. And then with that, on the basis of that, offer each next moment the best it could be in terms of the common good for all, in a sense, benefiting all of creation. And what that means for us is that if we're in tune with that we tend to follow that out, and that it will be best for us, but also best for those that we're in relationship with. But God's role is central in the process of the universe, and intimately involved in every single instance, every single moment. It's not something that comes and goes and that's whimsical. That God's at the heart of nature, as opposed to being something that interrupts nature in the natural process. So
that reminds me of a story that I once read from Anthony de Mello. It's called The Little Fish, and this little fish swims up to this older fish and says, "Older fish, can you help me? I'm searching for the ocean. Can you tell me where to find it?" And the older fish looks at the little fish and says, "Well, the ocean is what you're in now." And the little fish says, "Oh no, this is water. I'm looking for the ocean." And the little fish swims away.
That's perfect.
And goes in search. And then he goes in his story to say, a pilgrim comes to see the master dressed in sannyasi robes. And he speaks to him Sannyasi language and says, I am searching for God. And the master says to him, have you found him? And he says, no. Have you? Well, what could the master say? Golden sunlight shining through the door and bathing their entire table in that light. Out there is a beautiful tree, and he can hear the sound of children playing and laughing underneath the tree. Off in the distance, there's the sound of traffic on the freeway, and he can hear the buzz of a mosquito about to bite him. And he says, what can I say? And the man eventually goes off to search elsewhere. And then at the end of the story, he says, little fish, stop looking for the ocean. Just look. And I think that is a beautiful story that kind of captures what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's the process that we need to have in order to open ourselves up to that deeper reality.
Exactly.
We've got about, I think, 2 minutes, so if each of you had a final thought, that would be great, knowing we've got that little time left.
Well, just part of my concern comes at it from those who are in the extreme, in the scientific side. I would call them born again atheists, because they seek to impose their view of things in a very dogmatic kind of fashion. And I think for me, that's troubling, is that to get to that point, as opposed to seeing in a more humble way, how do we all work together in this process? Because I really think we have to do that.
And I think we started doing that today, and I really want to thank Monsignor Griesbach and Reverend Dr. David Roy for coming in today and sharing something they really hold passionately in their hearts and in their minds. The idea that there is something that we need to do to create an integration in the way that we think and feel and are that will not be at disharmony with reality, that we'll be in that ocean and knowing it for what it is. God bless.